The morning light from 3 different suns streamed through the giant windows of the Advanced Survival Engineering classroom at Galactic University. Professor Vexithar stood at the front of the room, his tall crystalline body catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. His voice echoed with a musical tone that all the translation devices picked up clearly. "Today marks your final practical examination," Professor Vexithar announced, his crystal face shifting colors to show his serious mood. "You will construct a fully functional emergency shelter. You have exactly 1 standard galactic hour. The shelter must protect against wind, cold, heat, and provide emergency communication capabilities." Taemin Park sat in the middle row, looking small compared to his alien classmates. The human exchange student had been quiet for most of the semester, watching and learning. Around him, students from 12 different worlds whispered excitedly about the challenge ahead. To his left sat Kira, a Veltari with 6 arms that moved independently. Her blue skin had patterns that changed color when she was thinking hard. She was already pulling out her calculation device and making notes with 3 hands, while the other 3 organized her tools. Behind Taemin, Thonks breathed methane through his breathing mask. The Grixian's large brain case pulsed with electrical activity as he processed information at incredible speed. His 4 eyes moved in different directions, taking in every detail of the materials laid out at the front of the classroom. Near the window, Zephyr stood perfectly still. The Luminari student looked like a walking plant, with green skin and leaves growing from her arms. She communicated by changing the color and brightness of patches on her body. Right now, she was glowing. Soft yellow, which meant she was curious and ready to learn. "The materials are simple," Professor Vexithar continued, gesturing toward several tables covered with metal sheets, binding compounds, basic tools, and electronic components. "You must use only what is provided. No personal equipment, no assistance from others. This test measures your ability to survive when technology fails and you have limited resources." Taemin looked at the materials with interest. He saw flexible metal sheets that could bend without breaking, some kind of strong glue or binding agent, basic hand tools like hammers and cutting devices, and small electronic pieces that looked like they could send emergency signals. The other students were already making complex plans. Kira was drawing detailed blueprints on her tablet, calculating stress points and load distribution. Thonks had his eyes closed, running thousands of possible designs through his powerful mind. Zephyr was talking to her plant-like teammates through light patterns, planning something that would grow rather than be built. Professor Vexithar walked slowly around the classroom, his crystal feet clicking on the floor. "This exercise demonstrates the importance of advanced planning and superior intellect," he said, looking directly at Taemin. "Survival is not about crude improvisation. It requires careful thought, mathematical precision, and technological understanding." The professor's teaching assistant, Dr. Naloth, floated beside him. The gas-based creature lived in a special containment suit and spoke through a voice synthesizer. "Professor, shall we begin timing now?" "Yes." "Students, you may begin. 1 hour starts now." The classroom exploded into activity. Kira's 6 arms moved like a dance as she began sorting materials by weight, strength, and flexibility. Thonks opened his eyes and walked purposefully toward the metal sheets, his analytical mind already knowing exactly what he needed. Zephyr and her team moved toward the organic binding agents, planning to create a living shelter that would adapt to conditions. Other students rushed forward with their own plans. The rock-like Storians began testing the hardness of different materials by hitting them against their stone bodies. The tentacled Aquarians were figuring out how to create a shelter that would work both in air and underwater. The energy-based Voltons were examining the electronic components to see how they could integrate power systems. In all this chaos, Taemin moved calmly toward the materials. He did not rush. He did not pull out any calculating devices. Instead, he picked up different pieces and felt their weight in his hands. He bent the metal sheets slightly to test their flexibility. He smelled the binding agents to understand their properties. He held the tools to feel their balance. Primitive examination techniques, Professor Vexthar whispered to Dr. Nal-Oth, loud enough for nearby students to hear. The human relies on crude sensory input rather than precise measurement. This will be educational for the other students to observe. Taemin ignored the comment. He had learned long ago that many aliens thought humans were less intelligent because they did not use complex technology for every task. But Taemin knew something the aliens did not understand. Humans had survived on a dangerous world for thousands of years. They had learned to build shelters quickly when storms came, when enemies attacked, when earthquakes struck. This knowledge was deep in human minds, passed down through generations. He watched his classmates working on their elaborate plans. Kira was still calculating, now using 4 hands to work on her tablet, while 2 hands sorted materials. Thonks had begun construction, but kept stopping to recalculate measurements. Zephyr's team was having a debate through light signals about the best way to make their organic shelter grow. Taemin had already decided on his approach. He would not build the strongest possible shelter or the most technologically advanced shelter. He would build a shelter that worked, that could be built quickly, and that would protect a person from danger. Simple, effective, fast. He selected his materials carefully. Flexible metal sheets that could form curves. Strong binding agent that would hold in extreme conditions. Basic tools for shaping and cutting. Emergency communication devices that were small and reliable. The other students were still planning when Taemin began to work. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, bending metal, applying binding agents, fitting pieces together. He did not measure twice and cut once like the saying went. Instead, he looked once and cut correctly the first time. Professor Vexthar watched with growing interest. The human's movements seemed almost random, but there was a pattern there. A rhythm, like he had done this many times before. Fascinating, Dr. Nal-Oth observed. The human appears to be working from instinct rather than planning. Dangerous approach, Professor Vexthar replied. Without proper calculations, his shelter will certainly fail the stress tests. But Taemin continued working, his confidence never wavering. Around him, his classmates were still in the early stages of construction, their complex plans requiring careful execution of each calculated step. The timer showed 50 minutes remaining. Most students had not yet begun actual construction. But Taemin's shelter was already taking shape, looking deceptively simple compared to the elaborate designs on his classmates' tablets. The real test was just beginning. The classroom buzzed with focused energy as each species began using their natural advantages. Professor Vexthar walked between the working students, his crystal body reflecting their various activities like a living mirror. Kira had transformed her workspace into a marvel of efficiency. Her 6 arms worked independently, each one handling a different task. 2 arms held metal sheets in precise positions, while a 3rd arm applied binding agent with mathematical accuracy. Her 4th arm operated measuring tools. The 5th arm made adjustments based on calculations, and the sixth arm updated her digital blueprints in real time. Her blue skin patterns shifted from calm blue to intense purple, showing her deep concentration. "Observe the Veltari approach," Professor Vexthar said to Dr. Naloth, speaking loud enough for students to hear. "Multiple appendages allow for parallel processing of construction tasks. What would take other species sequential steps, the Veltari can accomplish simultaneously. This is evolved efficiency." Kira's design was becoming impressive. She was building a geodesic dome structure with interlocking triangular panels. Each panel was precisely measured and cut to distribute weight evenly across the entire structure. Her calculations showed exactly how much wind pressure each joint could handle, how the temperature regulation would work, and where the communication equipment would integrate for optimal signal strength. Across the room, Thonks had finally begun construction after spending 20 minutes in pure calculation mode. The Grixian's massive brain had processed over 10,000 different design possibilities, analyzed the stress factors of each, and selected the mathematically optimal solution. His 4 eyes moved independently, allowing him to monitor multiple construction points without turning his head. Thonks was building something that looked more like a machine than a shelter. His design used rotating panels that could adjust to wind direction, expandable sections that responded to temperature changes, and a modular communication array that could boost signals by combining multiple transmitters. Every component had a specific mathematical relationship to every other component. The Grixian demonstrates the power of pure analytical thinking. Professor Vexithar continued his commentary. While others work from intuition or limited planning, Thonks has calculated the absolute optimal design. His shelter will not merely work, it will work perfectly under all possible conditions. Near the windows, Zephyr's team had created something completely different. The 3 Luminari students were growing their shelter rather than building it. They had mixed the organic binding agents with nutrients from their own bodies, creating a living material that could adapt and change. Their shelter looked like a large seed that was slowly opening. The walls were made of a substance that could harden like metal when needed or become flexible like fabric. The entire structure could photosynthesize energy from light, making it self-sustaining. The communication system was integrated into the living walls, using bioelectrical signals that could penetrate interference that would block traditional electronics. "Remarkable," Dr. Naloth observed. "The Luminari have essentially created a living building. It will adapt to threats rather than simply resisting them." The Storian students, with their rock-like bodies, were taking a completely different approach. They were building a shelter that looked like a fortress. Their natural ability to shape stone allowed them to fuse the metal sheets into solid walls. They did not worry about weight because their incredible strength made heavy materials easy to handle. Their shelter would survive almost any natural disaster, but it would be impossible for most other species to move or modify. The Storians saw this as a strength. A shelter should be permanent and absolutely secure. The Aquarian team worked with their tentacles moving in flowing patterns. Their shelter was designed to work both on land and underwater, with a flexible shape that could seal completely when submerged. Their tentacles could sense pressure changes and chemical compositions, so their shelter included warning systems that could detect dangerous gases or structural stress before sensors could measure them. Meanwhile, the Voltan students were creating something that was more energy than matter. Their electrical forms could inhabit and control the electronic components directly. Their shelter was a framework of basic materials that contained sophisticated energy fields. These fields could become solid barriers, generate heat or cooling, and communicate across vast distances by tapping into planetary electrical systems. Each approach showcased the unique evolution of its species. The Veltari had evolved multiple arms to handle complex tasks. The Grixians had developed massive brains to solve any problem through pure analysis. The Luminari had become living solar collectors who could grow rather than build. The Storians had become living rocks who valued permanent strength. The Aquarians had adapted to multiple environments. The Voltans had transcended physical limitations by becoming energy beings. Professor Vexithar nodded approvingly as he observed each group. This was exactly what he had hoped to demonstrate. Each species brought millions of years of evolutionary advantage to the problem. Each had developed sophisticated solutions that reflected their unique capabilities. You see, he explained to Dr. Nal Oth, survival engineering is not about simple improvisation. It requires the full application of evolved intelligence. Each species here represents a different path to optimal problem solving. He paused at Tae-Min's workspace. The human was working steadily, but his approach seemed almost primitive compared to the sophisticated engineering happening around him. Tae-Min was simply bending metal sheets into curves, connecting them with binding agent, and testing the joints by pushing and pulling on them with his hands. The human demonstrates the limitations of species that never fully evolved beyond basic survival instincts, Professor Vexthar observed. Notice how he relies on crude testing methods rather than precise measurement. He trusts his hands rather than instruments. He works from muscle memory rather than calculated planning. Tae-Min seemed unaware of the criticism. He continued working with quiet focus, occasionally stepping back to look at his progress, then making adjustments. His movements were fluid and confident, like he was following a pattern he had practiced many times before. The timer showed 35 minutes remaining. Most of the alien students were making good progress on their complex designs, though none were close to completion. Their sophisticated approaches required careful execution of each step. But something interesting was happening at Tae-Min's workspace. His simple-looking shelter was taking a recognizable shape much faster than expected. While the other students were still assembling components, Tae-Min's basic structure was nearly complete. Professor Vexthar frowned, his crystal body shifting to a slightly orange hue that indicated confusion. The human's approach looked too simple to be effective, yet it was proceeding with surprising speed. The real test would come when the structures were completed and put under stress. Then they would see which approach truly represented superior intelligence. But for now, the human continued working with steady determination, following patterns that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious planning. While his classmates continued their complex calculations and elaborate preparations, Tae-Min worked with a different kind of intelligence. His hands moved quickly but never wastefully, each motion serving a specific purpose that seemed to come from deep instinct rather than conscious planning. He had not drawn blueprints like Kira. He had not spent 20 minutes calculating like Thonks. He had not discussed strategy with teammates like Zephyr. Instead, Tae-Min had looked at the materials, felt their properties, and immediately understood what needed to be done. The metal sheets felt familiar in his hands, even though they were made from alien alloys. Metal was metal. It could be bent, shaped, joined, and stressed. These particular sheets had good flexibility without breaking, decent strength for their weight, and smooth edges that would not cut. Perfect for quick shelter construction. Tae-Min began with the foundation, not because his calculations told him to, but because thousands of years of human experience whispered that shelter started from the ground up. He shaped the metal into a circular base, using the natural curve of the material rather than fighting against it. The binding agent held the joints firmly while still allowing some flexibility for stress distribution. As he worked, memories seemed to guide his hands. Not his own memories, but deeper ones that belonged to his species. Humans building lean-tos against cave walls when the Ice Age came. Nomads raising tents in minutes when sandstorms appeared on the horizon. Soldiers constructing foxholes under enemy fire. Disaster victims creating emergency shelters from rubble after earthquakes. Each of these situations had taught humans the same lessons. Speed mattered more than perfection. Simple designs failed less often than complex ones. Materials should work with their natural properties, not against them. A shelter that protected you today was better than a perfect shelter you finish tomorrow. Taemin bent metal sheets into overlapping curves, creating a dome shape that would shed wind and rain naturally. He did not calculate the optimal curve, angle. His hands knew it from the shape that felt right, the shape that had worked for humans building similar structures for thousands of years. Professor Vexthar stopped beside Taemin's workspace, watching with growing curiosity. The human's technique looked crude, but there was an undeniable efficiency to it. While other students measured twice and cut once, Taemin seemed to measure once with his eyes and cut correctly every time. Interesting approach, Professor Vexthar said, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension. You work without calculations. How do you know your structure will be strong enough? Taemin looked up briefly from his work. I can feel it, he said simply, then returned to shaping another panel. The metal tells me how much stress it can handle. The joints show me where they want to flex. The shape shows me how wind will move around it. Dr. Naloth floated closer, intrigued despite himself. You anthropomorphize the materials. You speak as if they have consciousness. Not consciousness, Taemin replied, testing the flexibility of a joint by gently pushing it back and forth. But they have properties, natural behaviors. If you listen to them instead of fighting them, they work better. This was exactly the kind of primitive thinking Professor Vexthar expected from humans. They projected consciousness onto inanimate objects instead of understanding the mathematical principles that governed material behavior. Yet somehow, this primitive approach was producing results faster than the more sophisticated methods being used around the classroom. Taemin applied binding agent to connection points with quick, practiced motions. He did not measure the exact amount needed. His fingers knew how much was right, enough to hold firmly but not so much that it made the joint rigid. Rigid joints broke under stress. Flexible joints bent and survived. Around him, his classmates were making impressive progress on their complex designs, but they were still in construction phases that required careful attention to each calculated detail. Kira's 6 arms moved in perfect coordination, but she had to stop frequently to consult her measurements. Thonk's built with machine-like precision, but he recalculated stress factors before making each connection. Zephyr's living shelter was growing beautifully, but the organic process could not be rushed. The Storians were creating an incredibly strong fortress, but their heavy materials required careful positioning. The Aquarians were testing each component for both air and water functionality. The Voltans were integrating complex energy systems that needed precise calibration. All of these approaches were sophisticated and well-planned. but they were also slow. Taemin was working on the final sections of his shelter, while most of his classmates were still assembling primary components. His dome structure was taking shape with surprising speed, each new panel fitting naturally into place as if the design had been planned for years instead of improvised in minutes. "How do you work so quickly without making errors?" Dr. Naloth asked, genuinely curious now. Taemin paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. Humans were one of the few species in the class that still sweated when working hard, another primitive trait that the aliens found interesting. "Errors teach you," Taemin said. "My species has made millions of shelters over thousands of years. Every mistake taught us something. Every failure showed us what not to do. All of that learning is still with us, in our hands, in our instincts." He returned to work, installing the communication equipment with the same instinctive efficiency. He did not need to understand the alien technology completely. He just needed to understand its basic function: send signals, receive signals, provide power. The mounting points were obvious once you stopped thinking about complex integration and just looked at where the equipment wanted to go. Professor Vexithar shook his crystal head. "Instinct is not intelligence. Knowledge passed through genetic memory is inferior to knowledge gained through systematic analysis." "Maybe," Taemin agreed, connecting the final power coupling. "But sometimes you don't have time for systematic analysis. Sometimes the storm is coming and you need shelter now." As if responding to his words, the timer display showed 25 minutes remaining. Most students were still deeply involved in construction, their sophisticated designs requiring careful execution of many complex steps. But Taemin's shelter was nearly complete. The dome shape was finished, the joints were secure, the weatherproofing was in place, and the communication system was powered up. All that remained was final testing and adjustment. He stepped back to examine his work. The shelter did not look as impressive as the elaborate structures taking shape around the classroom. It was simple, functional, and unpretentious, but it was also nearly finished, while the more complex designs still had significant work remaining. In the observation gallery above the classroom, Ginny Kim leaned forward with interest. She was a human xenobiology student who had come to watch the exam, curious to see how her fellow human would perform among the alien students. She recognized something in Taemin's work that the aliens did not understand. It was not primitive. It was refined by countless generations of humans who had needed to build shelter quickly under pressure. Every motion, every choice, every technique represented the distilled wisdom of a species that had survived by being fast, flexible, and effective rather than perfect. The other students continued their careful work, unaware that the quiet human in the middle of the classroom was about to demonstrate something that would change their understanding of intelligence itself. The timer continued counting down, but Taemin's race against time was nearly over. His simple approach was about to prove that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was knowing when not to be sophisticated at all. The classroom had settled into focused concentration when Taemin did something unexpected. He stopped working and stepped back from his completed shelter. The timer showed 51 minutes remaining. Professor Vexthar's crystal body flickered from its usual steady blue to a confused orange. His four eyes focused on the human's workspace, trying to understand what he was seeing. The shelter was finished. Not mostly finished, not nearly complete. Entirely finished and ready for testing. Impossible, Professor Vexthar muttered, his musical voice carrying a discordant note. The examination period is 1 hour. No student has ever completed construction in less than 45 minutes. Dr. Naloth floated quickly over to Taemin's shelter, scanning it with built-in sensors. Professor, the structure appears to meet all basic requirements. It has weatherproofing, structural integrity, and integrated communication systems. Around the classroom, other students were becoming aware of what had happened. Kira's pattern-changing skin shifted to surprised yellow as she looked over at the completed human shelter. 2 of her 6 arms paused in their precise work as she tried to understand how anyone could finish so quickly. Thonks's 4 eyes swiveled toward Taemin's workspace while his hands continued their methodical construction. His massive brain was recalculating, trying to figure out what shortcuts the human might have taken. But his sensors confirmed what Dr. Naloth had reported. The shelter met all the stated requirements. Zephyr's bioluminescent patches flashed in rapid patterns as she communicated with her teammates. Their living shelter was growing beautifully, but it was still only half-formed. How had the human finished a complete structure while they were still in the growth phase? The Storian students paused their heavy lifting to examine Taemin's work. Their rock-like faces could not show expression, but their body language indicated confusion. They had been building what they considered a quick and simple fortress design, yet the human had finished faster with materials they would have considered too light for serious construction. Professor Vexthar walked slowly around Taemin's shelter, his crystal form reflecting light in sharp analytical patterns. The structure was undeniably complete. It formed a dome about 3 meters across and 2 meters high, large enough for a person to live in comfortably, small enough to heat efficiently. The walls were made of overlapping metal panels that shed water naturally while allowing air circulation. The joints were flexible enough to handle wind stress, but strong enough to maintain structural integrity. The communication equipment was mounted at the optimal height for signal transmission and protected from weather damage. "Run full diagnostics," Professor Vexthar ordered Dr. Naloth. "I want complete structural analysis, weatherproofing tests, and communication verification." As Dr. Naloth began his detailed scans, Taemin stood quietly beside his work. He was not celebrating or showing off. He simply waited calmly for the testing to begin, occasionally adjusting small details that caught his attention. "How did you work so quickly?" Professor Vexthar asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity mixed with skepticism. "What shortcuts did you take?" "No shortcuts," Taemin replied. "I just built what was needed instead of building what was perfect." This answer frustrated Professor Vexthar. In his experience, optimal solutions required careful analysis and precise execution. Speed usually meant sacrificing quality or safety. Yet the preliminary scans suggested that Taemin's shelter was not only complete, but also functionally sound. "Doctor," Naloth finished his initial assessment. "Professor, all systems are operational. Structural integrity exceeds minimum requirements by 15%. Weatherproofing is complete and effective. Communication systems are properly integrated and functioning." The classroom had grown quiet as other students stopped work to listen. Even the most focused aliens were distracted by the impossible situation developing at Taemin's workspace. Professor Vexthar's crystal body shifted through several colors as he processed this information. Orange confusion mixed with red irritation and blue analytical focus. "There must be hidden flaws. We will conduct stress testing immediately." He activated the classroom's environmental control systems. Artificial wind began blowing across Taimin's shelter, starting gently but increasing quickly to storm levels. The dome shape handled the wind naturally, its curved surface directing airflow around and over the structure instead of fighting against it. "Increase wind speed to hurricane levels," Professor Vex Thar commanded. The wind howled through the classroom, forcing other students to secure their work materials. Taimin's shelter swayed slightly with the pressure, but maintained its structural integrity. The flexible joints that Professor Vexithar had considered primitive were actually absorbing and distributing the stress more effectively than rigid connections would have. Next came temperature testing. The environmental systems created extreme heat followed by freezing cold. Taimin's weatherproofing held perfectly, maintaining comfortable internal temperature while the outside conditions fluctuated wildly. "Seismic simulation!" Professor Vexthar ordered, his voice tight with disbelief. The floor began to shake and roll like an earthquake. Other students had to stop work completely to avoid injury, but Taimin's shelter rode the motion like a boat on waves. Its flexible foundation and curved walls distributed the seismic energy without structural damage. Finally, Professor Vexthar tested the communication systems. He jammed all standard frequencies, created electromagnetic interference, and simulated atmospheric distortion. Taimin's equipment cut through the interference clearly, its simple design proving more robust than complex systems that relied on multiple components working in perfect coordination. Dr. Nal-Oth stared at his scanner readings in amazement. "Professor, the shelter has passed every test with performance levels that exceed our optimal design parameters. The human has created a structure that is not only functional, but remarkably effective." In the observation gallery, Jin-A Kim smiled with pride. She had seen this before in human engineering. Solutions that looked simple but incorporated sophisticated understanding of how materials and forces actually behaved in real-world conditions. Wu Jin Lee, another human observer, was recording everything on his tablet. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough that could change how the galaxy viewed human capabilities. Down in the classroom, other students were staring at Taimin's shelter with new understanding. Kira's calculation-dependent approach suddenly seemed unnecessarily complex. Thonks's mathematically perfect design felt over-engineered. Even Zephyr's elegant living shelter seemed slow compared to the human's rapid construction. Professor Vexthar stood silently for several minutes, his crystal form cycling through colors as he processed what had happened. His academic understanding of intelligence and problem-solving was being challenged by a simple dome built by a supposedly primitive species. "This is unexpected," he finally admitted, his musical voice subdued. "Your approach defies conventional engineering wisdom, yet produces superior results." Taimin nodded respectfully. "Different species solve problems differently. Humans learned to build fast and build well because slow shelters meant death. We had to develop techniques that worked quickly under pressure." The timer still showed 43 minutes remaining. Other students were not even halfway through their construction processes, yet the human had not only finished, but had passed stress tests that would challenge much more elaborate designs. Professor Vexthar looked around at his other students, then back at Taimin's completed shelter. Something fundamental was happening here. Something that would require him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about intelligence, engineering, and the relationship between sophistication and effectiveness. The examination was far from over, but the results were already clear. The human had not just completed the assignment, he had redefined what completion meant. As the other students continued working on their elaborate designs with 30 minutes remaining, Professor Vexthar made an unprecedented decision. He called for a temporary pause in the examination to conduct an impromptu analysis of Tae-min's construction methods. Dr. Nal Oth, activate the classroom recording systems, he announced. I want every detail of this construction documented for academic review. Around the classroom, alien students looked up from their work with expressions of confusion and curiosity. Never before had Professor Vexthar interrupted an examination for analysis. Kira's 6 arms paused in their coordinated dance. Thonks's 4 eyes focused on the developing situation. Zephyr's bioluminescent patterns shifted to questioning yellow. Mr. Park, Professor Vexthar said formally, would you demonstrate your construction process again using identical materials? I wish to understand the specific techniques that produced such remarkable results. Tae-min nodded and moved to a fresh set of materials that Dr. Naloth quickly arranged. But before he began, Hun-Su Nam, a human anthropologist who had been observing from the gallery, requested permission to speak. Professor, may I provide context about human evolutionary development that might help explain what you are observing? Professor Vexthar's crystal form brightened with interest. Please, proceed, Dr. Nam. Hyun-Soo descended to the classroom floor, his academic credentials displaying on the room's information screens. Humans evolved on a planet with extreme environmental challenges, he began. Unlike many species that developed intelligence in stable environments, human intelligence evolved specifically to solve immediate survival problems under pressure. As he spoke, Tae-min began construction again, this time working more slowly so that observers could follow his process. His hands moved with the same confident efficiency, but now every motion was visible and analyzable. For millions of years, Hyun-Soo continued, humans faced predators, natural disasters, climate changes, and resource scarcity. Those who could quickly build effective shelters survived. Those who could not died. This created intense evolutionary pressure for rapid, problem-solving abilities. Professor Vexthar watched as Tae-min selected materials, his sensors recording every detail. But rapid selection should produce inferior results compared to analytical optimization. That is where human evolution became unique, Hyun-Soo explained. Humans did not just develop individual intelligence. They developed collective intelligence, the ability to pass survival knowledge through culture, language, and physical practice. Tae-min was shaping the first metal panel, his hands automatically finding the optimal curve. Dr. Naloth's sensors showed that the curve matched mathematical models for optimal stress distribution, even though Tae-min had not performed any calculations. Watch. His hand positions, Hyun-Soo pointed out. Every human child learns to work with materials through play, experimentation, and cultural transmission. By adulthood, optimal techniques become unconscious knowledge stored in muscle memory and spatial reasoning. The Storian students pressed closer to observe. Their species had evolved individual strength but limited adaptability. They were fascinated by the concept of knowledge being passed through generations of practice rather than genetic programming. Tae-min applied binding agent to connection points, his fingers automatically dispensing the correct amount for optimal joint flexibility. This technique, Hyun-Soo noted, represents the accumulated experience of thousands of human builders. Each generation refined the methods and passed improvements to the next generation. Fascinating, Professor Vexthar observed. Individual intelligence enhanced by collective memory. But how does this produce solutions that exceed our analytical methods? Hyun-Soo smiled. Because human survival intelligence evolved to handle variables that analytical methods struggle with: unpredictable conditions, imperfect materials, time pressure, and incomplete information. Humans learned to find solutions that worked reliably under real-world constraints rather than optimal solutions that worked perfectly under ideal conditions. Taemin was assembling the dome structure, each panel fitting naturally into place. His construction demonstrated principles that alien engineering had discovered through mathematical analysis, but implemented through intuitive understanding of how materials behaved under stress. "Observe the joint design," Dr. Naloth pointed out. "The human creates connections that are strong enough to maintain structure, but flexible enough to absorb stress. Our calculations show this as optimal, but we required computer modeling to determine the exact parameters. Humans learned this through trial and error over generations," Hyun-Soo explained. "Every joint that broke taught lessons. Every connection that held taught different lessons. Eventually, humans developed intuitive understanding of optimal joint design without needing to calculate it. The Aquarian students were particularly interested in this concept. Their species had evolved in a stable underwater environment where conditions were predictable. The idea of intelligence that adapted to constantly changing conditions was foreign to their experience. As Taemin worked, Professor Vexthar began to understand something profound. The human approach is not less sophisticated than our analytical methods. It is differently sophisticated. Where we use calculation to determine optimal solutions, humans use accumulated experience to recognize optimal patterns. "Exactly," Hyun-Soo confirmed. "Human intelligence evolved to recognize patterns quickly and accurately, even with incomplete information. This allows for rapid decision-making under pressure, which was essential for survival." Taemin completed the second shelter in 12 minutes, even with the slower demonstration pace. The structure was identical to his first shelter in all important aspects: same strength, same flexibility, same efficiency. "Remarkable consistency," Dr. Naloth observed. "The human produces nearly identical results without measuring tools or calculation devices. This suggests that pattern recognition has achieved precision comparable to analytical methods." Professor Vexithar's understanding was evolving rapidly. "Dr. Nam, are you suggesting that human intelligence represents an alternative evolutionary path to problem-solving? One that achieves sophistication through accumulated experience rather than individual analytical capability?" "Precisely," Hyun-Soo replied. "Most species develop intelligence either through individual capability like the Grixians or through specialized physical adaptations like the Veltari. Humans developed intelligence as a collective cultural phenomenon that could be passed between generations and improved continuously." The implications were staggering. Around the classroom, alien students were reconsidering their understanding of intelligence itself. Kira's calculation-dependent approach suddenly seemed limited to individual capability. Thonks's analytical methods, while powerful, could only work with information available to a single mind. This explains the speed advantage, Professor Vexthar realized. Where our methods require individual analysis of each situation, human methods can apply pre-tested solutions immediately. The analysis was done by previous generations. And the reliability advantage, Dr. Naloth added. Solutions tested by thousands of practitioners under varying conditions are more robust than solutions developed through theoretical analysis alone. So Young Park, a human engineering student in the gallery, had been documenting everything. She understood that this demonstration was more than an academic exercise. It was the first formal recognition that human engineering philosophy represented legitimate alternative to alien analytical approaches. Professor Vexthar studied both of Taemin's shelters, his crystal form cycling through colors that indicated rapid processing of new concepts. We have been measuring intelligence by individual analytical capability, but humans demonstrate collective intelligence that accumulates and refines solutions across generations. Different species, different intelligence strategies, Taemin said simply. Your people became smart by thinking harder. My people became smart by remembering better and sharing more. The timer showed 20 minutes remaining, but the real education was happening at Taemin's workspace. The galaxy's understanding of intelligence, engineering, and problem-solving was being fundamentally challenged by a simple demonstration of human construction techniques. Professor Vexthar realized that his examination had become something much more significant than a test of student capabilities. It had become a revelation about the nature of intelligence itself. The remaining 20 minutes of the examination transformed into an unprecedented learning experience as alien students began questioning their fundamental assumptions about intelligence and problem-solving. Professor Vexthar had suspended normal testing protocols to facilitate what was becoming the most significant educational moment of his career. Kira was the first to approach Taemin directly. Her 6 arms moved in the gestures that indicated deep curiosity among her species. "May I examine your construction techniques?" she asked, her skin patterns shifting to respectful blue. "Of course," Taemin replied, moving aside so she could inspect his shelter closely. Kira's multiple appendages allowed her to examine the structure from several angles simultaneously. Her advanced sensors could measure stress distribution, joint, flexibility, and material integration with precision that exceeded the classroom equipment. What she discovered challenged everything she had learned about optimal construction. "The joint connections are not mathematically perfect," she observed, "yet they perform better than my calculated optimal joints. How is this possible?" Taemin picked up a piece of binding agent and a metal panel. "Perfect joints break under unexpected stress. These joints are designed to handle stress that we cannot predict or calculate." He demonstrated by applying the binding agent in a pattern that looked irregular but felt right in his hands. "My ancestors built shelters during earthquakes, storms, attacks by predators, and situations where everything went wrong at once. They learned that perfect joints fail when conditions are not perfect." Kira tested the joint Taemin had created, applying stress from multiple directions. Her sensors confirmed that the seemingly imperfect connection outperformed her mathematically optimized joints under varied stress conditions. "Remarkable," she said, her skin patterns shifting to amazed yellow. "You optimize for unknown variables rather than known parameters." Meanwhile, Thonks had been running calculations in his massive brain, trying to understand how intuitive construction could exceed analytical methods. His 4 eyes focused on different aspects of Taemin's work, while his mind processed thousands of engineering possibilities. "I have analyzed 17,000 possible shelter designs," Thonks announced, his analytical voice carrying a note of confusion. "Your design does not appear in my optimal results, yet it outperforms all of them. My calculations must be incomplete." Professor Vexthar, who had been observing these interactions with growing fascination, moved closer to Thonks. "Perhaps the problem is not with your calculations, but with the assumptions underlying them." "Explain," Thonks requested, his massive intellect focused entirely on this puzzle. Your calculations assume ideal conditions, perfect materials, and predictable stress patterns, Professor Vexthar realized. But real survival situations involve imperfect materials, unpredictable conditions, and unknown variables. The human approach optimizes for real-world variability rather than theoretical perfection. This revelation struck Thonks with the force of a major paradigm shift. His species had evolved to solve problems through pure analytical thinking, but they had always worked within controlled environments where variables could be measured and predicted. The concept of designing for unmeasurable variables was foreign to his experience. Zephyr approached with her teammates, their bioluminescent patterns creating a complex conversation in light. As living beings who grew their shelters rather than building them, they were fascinated by construction techniques that mimicked organic adaptability. "Your shelter behaves like a living organism," Zephyr observed, her patterns shifting to curious green. "It adapts to stress rather than simply resisting it. How did you learn to build with organic principles?" "Humans learned from everything," Tae-min explained. "We watched how trees bend in wind, how caves protect from storms, how animal shelters handle different weather. We copied what worked and avoided what failed." The Luminari students exchanged rapid light patterns as they processed this information. Their species had always assumed that living solutions were superior to constructed solutions. The idea that constructed solutions could incorporate living principles through observation and adaptation was revolutionary to their thinking. Dr. Ithara, Professor Vexthar's research partner who had been summoned to observe the situation, floated into the classroom in her environmental containment suit. As a gas-based being, she experienced reality through different sensory modalities than solid species, giving her unique perspective on the unfolding demonstration. "Professor Vexthar," she said through her voice synthesizer, "I have been monitoring the examination through remote sensors. The human's approach represents something we have never encountered in our research: practical intelligence that achieves theoretical optimization through non-theoretical methods." Professor Vexithar's crystal form brightened with the excitement of discovery. "Dr. Ithara, I believe we are observing the first documented case of evolutionary intelligence that surpasses analytical intelligence in practical applications." Around them, students from different species were beginning to interact in ways that had never happened before in the classroom. The Storians, with their focus on permanent strength, were discussing flexibility concepts with the Aquarians. The Voltans were comparing energy-based solutions with Tae-min's material-based approaches. "This changes our understanding of intelligence classification," Dr. Ithara observed. "We have always categorized intelligence by processing capability, individual analytical power, collective computational ability, or specialized adaptation efficiency. But humans demonstrate a cumulative experiential intelligence that transcends individual capability through cultural transmission." The implications were profound. Every species in the galaxy had been classified according to their intelligence type, with analytical capabilities considered the highest form of problem-solving ability. But humans were demonstrating that experiential intelligence could achieve results that exceeded pure analytical methods. Minho Yoon, who had been observing from the diplomatic section of the gallery, understood that this moment had significance far beyond academic curiosity. As a representative of the human diplomatic corps, he recognized that the galaxy's perception of human capabilities was shifting in real time. Professor Vexithar addressed the entire classroom, his voice carrying authority mixed with humility. "Students, we are witnessing a paradigm shift in our understanding of intelligence and problem-solving. The human approach demonstrates that there are forms of sophisticated thinking that we have not recognized or valued appropriately. He gestured toward Taemin's shelters, which continued to perform flawlessly under ongoing environmental stress. Mr. Park has shown us that practical wisdom accumulated through generations of experience can produce results that exceed individual analytical capability. This is not primitive intelligence. It is differently evolved intelligence. The alien students looked at Taemin with new respect and curiosity. What they had initially dismissed as crude improvisation was revealed as the application of sophisticated collective intelligence refined through millennia of practical application. I propose, Professor Vexisthar continued, that we expand this examination into a full research project. Dr. Ithara, would you be willing to collaborate on a comprehensive study of human problem-solving methodologies? Absolutely, Dr. Ithara replied. This could revolutionize our approach to engineering education galaxy-wide. The timer showed 5 minutes remaining, but the real education had already concluded. The examination had become a demonstration that would influence galactic thinking about intelligence, survival, and the relationship between analytical and experiential knowledge. Taemin stood quietly among his alien classmates, unaware that his simple demonstration of human construction techniques had initiated a fundamental shift in how the galaxy understood intelligence itself. The quiet human student had become the catalyst for a new era of interspecies learning and cooperation. The reverberations of this classroom demonstration would eventually reach every corner of galactic civilization, challenging assumptions and opening new possibilities for understanding the diverse forms that intelligence could take. 6 months after the shelter construction examination, the advanced survival engineering classroom looked completely different. Where once Professor Vexthar had taught from a position of crystalline authority, dispensing analytical wisdom to receptive alien minds, now he found himself learning alongside his students in an entirely transformed educational environment. The change had begun immediately after Taemin's demonstration. Word of the human students' remarkable performance had spread throughout Galactic University within hours, reaching the highest levels of academic administration by the end of that same day. Dr. Ithara's preliminary report had triggered emergency meetings among species representatives, leading to the most comprehensive revision of intelligence classification systems in galactic history. Today, Professor Vexthar stood before a mixed species class that included not only the original alien students, but also a dozen human exchange students who had arrived to participate in the new Applied Survival Intelligence curriculum. The classroom itself had been reconfigured to accommodate both analytical and experiential learning methods. Class, Professor Vexthar announced, his crystal form glowing with colors that indicated enthusiasm mixed with humility. Today we will continue our study of integrated problem-solving approaches. Mr. Park will demonstrate human rapid construction techniques while Ms. Kira provides analytical framework analysis. The partnership between Taemin and Kira had become the cornerstone of the new educational approach. Her 6 arms could work on mathematical modeling while simultaneously observing and recording his intuitive techniques. Together, they were developing teaching methods that combined alien analytical precision with human experiential wisdom. The shelter design we will examine today, Taemin began, moving toward the materials table, comes from human Arctic survival traditions. It needs to be built quickly in extreme cold using materials that may be damaged or incomplete. As he worked, Kira's multiple appendages created real-time mathematical models of his construction process. Her skin patterns displayed stress calculations, material compatibility analyses, and structural optimization data that made Taemin's intuitive choices visible to species that learn through numerical understanding. Observe the material selection pattern, Kira noted, her analytical voice now carrying warm respect. Taemin evaluates 7 different properties simultaneously through tactile examination: flexibility, density, thermal conductivity, surface friction, chemical compatibility, fatigue resistance, and stress distribution characteristics. His hands process this information faster than our scanners can measure it. Around the classroom, alien students watched with fascination as human intuition was translated into analytical concepts they could understand and incorporate into their own problem-solving approaches. The Grixian students were learning to trust initial assessments rather than overanalyzing every decision. The Luminari were discovering how observation of natural patterns could accelerate their organic construction methods. Dr. Ithara floated between student workstations, her gas form contained within advanced mobility equipment that allowed her to participate directly in the learning process. The integration of analytical and experiential methods is producing results that exceed either approach used independently, she observed. Students are achieving construction times 30% faster than previous records while maintaining structural integrity 15% higher than baseline requirements. But the implications extended far beyond improved academic performance. Minho Yoon, now serving as Director of Human-Alien Educational Exchange, had been documenting how the new teaching methods were changing relationships between species throughout the university. Species barriers are dissolving, he reported to the Human Diplomatic Corps. Alien students who once considered humans primitive are now seeking human mentorship. Human students who felt intimidated by alien analytical capabilities are discovering that their experiential knowledge is equally valuable. We are seeing unprecedented levels of interspecies collaboration. The transformation was visible in every corner of the classroom. Thonks, the analytical Grixian, was working alongside Da-Un Choi, a human engineering student, to develop construction techniques that combined mathematical optimization with practical adaptability. His massive brain provided computational power while her human experience provided real-world wisdom about how materials behaved under unpredictable conditions. "Your species taught me something profound," Thonk said to Da-Un as they tested a joint design that incorporated both calculated precision and adaptive flexibility. Intelligence is not just about processing capability, it is about the wisdom to know which processing approach serves the situation best. Near the windows, Zephyr was collaborating with Hyun-Soo Nam to develop living shelters that could be grown quickly in emergency situations. The Luminari's natural ability to create organic structures was being enhanced by human knowledge of rapid deployment techniques developed through millennia of crisis response. Human experience with emergency construction is teaching us to create living shelters that mature rapidly rather than growing slowly, Zephyr explained, her bioluminescent patterns bright with excitement. Your species' understanding of time pressure is revolutionizing our approach to organic architecture. Professor Vexthar moved between student groups, his role transformed from dispenser of knowledge to facilitator of discovery. The crystalline being who had once considered analytical thinking superior to all other forms of intelligence now served as a bridge between different cognitive approaches. "Mr. Park," he said, approaching Taemin's latest construction, "your technique continues to yield insights that challenge our fundamental assumptions. This shelter design incorporates principles that our theoretical models suggest should be mutually exclusive." Taemin looked up from his work, which had attracted a cluster of fascinated alien observers. Professor, human survival often required doing things that seemed impossible. When you need shelter that is both strong and light, both flexible and rigid, both simple and sophisticated, you learn to find ways to make contradictions work together. Dr. Ithara recorded this exchange with particular interest. Human ability to reconcile seemingly contradictory requirements was becoming a central focus of galactic engineering research. Traditional alien approaches sought optimal solutions within defined parameters, but humans demonstrated the ability to transcend parameter limitations through creative integration. The broader implications were reshaping galactic civilization. So Young Park, now working as a liaison between human and alien research institutions, had documented over 300 collaborative projects that emerged from the teaching methods pioneered in Professor Vexthar's classroom. The shelter construction. Demonstration was just the beginning, she reported to the Galactic Academic Council. Human experiential intelligence is proving valuable in fields ranging from rapid disaster response to deep space exploration. Alien analytical capabilities are helping humans understand why their intuitive approaches work and how to refine them further. As the class period concluded, students from 12 different species worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old educational paradigm. The rigid boundaries between analytical and experiential intelligence had dissolved into collaborative approaches that leverage the strengths of different cognitive styles. Next week, Professor Vexthar announced, we will begin our examination of human disaster response techniques. Mr. Park will demonstrate rapid medical shelter construction while Dr. Naloth provides biological compatibility analysis. But beyond the academic schedule lay a larger transformation. The quiet human student who had completed a shelter in 10 minutes had catalyzed a fundamental shift in how galactic civilization understood intelligence, cooperation, and the value of diverse approaches to problem solving. As students filed out of the classroom, Taemin remained behind to clean up his materials. Professor Vexthar approached him, his crystal form glowing with colors that indicated deep gratitude and respect. Mr. Park, he said formally, I must thank you for teaching me the most important lesson of my academic career. Intelligence is not a hierarchy with analytical thinking at the top. Intelligence is a spectrum with each species contributing unique capabilities that become more powerful when combined with others. Taemin smiled and continued packing his tools. Professor, humans have a saying, many hands make light work. I think maybe it should be, many minds make wise solutions. Professor Vexthar's crystal form brightened with what might have been alien laughter. Indeed, Mr. Park, indeed. Outside, the classroom windows, ships from dozens of worlds arrived daily at Galactic University, bringing students and researchers eager to participate in the new era of collaborative learning that had begun with a simple demonstration of human shelter construction. The galaxy was discovering that intelligence, like survival, was not about individual superiority, but about collective wisdom that honored and integrated the unique contributions of every species. The revolution that began in a single classroom was spreading to every corner of galactic civilization, one collaboration at a time.